Hi, I'm Alex.
And I'm Dani.
And we're seriously nerdy about a lot of stuff.
And we're especially nerdy about the 1993 cult classic Halloween film,
Hocus Pocus!
That's pretty good.
We did it. We did it at the same time.
With an intimidating level of
Maybe we don't have to do anything else. So this month we decided to do something themed on Hocus Pocus since Hocus Pocus 2 is coming out.
A quick disclaimer before we start.
This video is in no way sponsored or endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or its affiliates. It's entirely a fan project.
Because we're fans. September marks the beginning of spoopy season, and when Alex and I were recently at a local craft store, we came across a book that's also a box, and it said, "It's all a bunch of Hocus Pocus." And we said, "Challenge accepted, cardboard box book." So we took said book box and we decided to turn it into book from Hocus Pocus.
Book! No, that was terrible.
That was not good. I was 5 when Hocus Pocus came out. The fact that there was a little brunette girl who was a little precocious and her name was Dani was a really big deal for me because you instantly get dibs on that character when you're playing with your cousins.
I didn't think Max was very cool, to be honest.
What?
Yeah, I didn't.
Max was so cool.
You know who was cool? Thackeray Binks.
Emily!
We have some 3D files to print for it, and we think you're gonna enjoy it.
This is the book as it arrived from Michaels, and we knew instantly that this glossy coating was not going to cut it for all of the craft supplies that this was going to have to endure. So quick sand and then a coat of Mod Podge with some paint just to kind of seal it in and keep all that paper from warping. One of the big aspects of the Sanderson Sisters Museum, of course, is that beautiful wood floor, and there's nothing that makes a fast wood floor for tabletop miniature scale better than wooden coffee stirrers. So after distressing these babies, it was time to think through another aspect of flooring, which is, of course, the staircase and the wood beams that frame out the museum. So all of this was, let's put in the infrastructure before we can do the fun stuff. We had to get through building the museum before we could furnish it with adorable tiny things. If you watched the Mario video, you've seen my favorite trick, which is let's draw directly into styrofoam and sort of be able to give it textures and things like that. It's a really easy way with this high density styrofoam to get great texture. This high-density styrofoam can be any manner of little objects and just takes texture incredibly well. So working from this blueprint that just gave me a basic sort of version of what this side of the house, the Sanderson Sisters house, could be, I started to lay in flooring here. We're getting closer and closer to let's make adorable tiny things. But first, we've got to build these witches a house. So again, my favorite medium here, working with high-density styrofoam. I'd originally planned on actually crafting the staircase out of wood, and quickly realized I did not have the skill or the patience for that, so we went real sloppy with some cut styrofoam glued together and more coffee stir sticks to plank the stairs. The end result was pretty good. Fortunately, the craftsmanship in the 1600s was not 10 out of 10, but I swear on all things decent and holy, if you ever made me build another tiny staircase, I would either 3D print it or force Alex to do it. This is my first and only tabletop scale miniature staircase, and you can quote me on that later when I do it again and say, but this time it was different. No, please let this be the last one. So there weren't great reference photos as I was searching the web for Hocus Pocus, so this is sort of an amalgamation of different aspects, different scenes in the film and kind of things that you could see on screen. Full disclosure, I did not have any sort of professional insights into what the set of Hocus Pocus looked like. This was me just watching the film and pausing it, or seeing what pictures exist online from the 1993 film. So it's not a perfect replica, it's more of how it feels, or sort of certain elements that you see when you're watching the film. But all in all, I knew that it had this downstairs with some wooden clapboard, and then upstairs is kind of a mystery. We don't see upstairs a whole lot, so I took a lot of creative liberty. But I love this L-shaped staircase they have. We don't super know where it goes, but we do see it briefly in the film. Now's the very visually satisfying element of basing everything out in black airbrush. This is a technique I think that we need to pull out more often. It's always complicated to have to clean the airbrush afterward, but the result is so satisfying. And I was able to come in with a little white highlight here. It's called a zenithal highlight, if you're a big nerd like we are. And what it does is when I layer on these colored paints on top of it in very thin layers, it lets that white pop through and gives super lazy lighting effects. People that professionally craft will probably disagree with that and tell me there's other reasons, but basically I'm just using the underlay of white airbrush paint under there and very thin paint in order to make myself look fancy. Zenithal highlight. And then it's just pulling out all of the usual tricks. Some shade, some dry brush, make it happen. In the description, you'll see we've linked some 3D files for this adorable study furniture set. So painted those up off camera and then was ready to start furnishing the Sanderson Museum. So this was a trial test of some of the artifacts in the museum are under glass. I briefly considered cutting tiny plexiglass screens out for them, but realized I don't have the patience or talent for that. So I thought I might try casting resin that would look like they're in kind of a glass case. It's not perfect, they're clearly sitting inside resin, but when you paint it up, maybe that's a little display case of random witch paraphernalia. I'm going to do the same thing with book here. So took a writing desk from those 3D print files and then absolutely ruined it and cut it into a million pieces to make it as close to the bookcase that we see in the film that I could get to, but it's not perfect. So when you look it up later and go, wait a minute, your bookcase doesn't look like the one in the movie. I was trying, okay? I was trying my best. So this little monster is like 1 part 3D print file, twisty wire, lots of glue, like a dangerous amount of glue, like an explosive amount of glue, and then every trick in the book in terms of how can we make him look fancy. And again, I'm going to try this resin trick. It didn't look too bad, especially when you paint up a little frame around him. It looks like he could be a book encased in glass. You don't know. Work smarter, not harder. One element I knew I wanted to include was the black flame candle, but I didn't have a ton of visual reference for what that candelabra looked like. So I'm kind of making it up. It's a creative interpretation. I know it's some sort of a wrought iron stand. I definitely know what the candle itself looks like. And then the stand has sort of a cage around it, and I couldn't figure out how to replicate that until I realized that the bags that they give you at the Apple Store have this really interesting paper product that you can take apart and use for your own means. Now, if you're paying close attention here to some of the paint color selections, then there will be a payoff at the end for you. But this is just a pewter cauldron that we had from a witch set. I thought, it seems like an easy way to take care of the Sanderson sisters cauldron. Of course, the cauldron in the film is wired up to the ceiling and sort of has a chain that pulls. Ours is just going to sit in the middle. It wouldn't be a witch movie without a little bit of magic, and that magic is in the form of magnets. So I did take 2 very strong magnets. I put one behind the wood beam, and the other I concealed inside this little tangle of dried grass, and was able to make a little witch broom. Now it's time for cages. And I had watched a fellow YouTuber make a beautiful tiny bird cage, and it just looked effortless. This thing turned out perfect, and I went, oh, chunky metal cages, this'll be a dream. No. Also, never again. No more tiny cages. Do you know how hard it was to paint inside the cage? Why wouldn't you have painted the inside before you attached the bottom, Dani? I don't know. That's a great question. I think one of the most fun aspects of this project was propping out all of the little details. So there's a back shelf in the Sanderson Sisters Museum that's just covered in bottles, potions, things like that. So to sort of prop this out with my little coven of Citadel shades here was very satisfying. And then the nice thing is, since this museum is fairly old, you can cover your mistakes with null oil. It's my tried and true technique. But really putting all these little miniature babies in was very satisfying. This is a pretty lazy but effective trick, and that is wet any type of fabric in Mod Podge and let it dry, and it gets pretty dang hard. So I wanted to have some cloaks hanging over on the wall that just were sort of a nod to Winnifred, Mary, and Sarah's cloaks. That was just a quick soak fabric that we already had in Mod Podge, let it dry, and then paint it up and trim it, and they make for some nice accessories along the back wall. This is for the front area that you see as soon as Max and Dani and Allison arrive at the museum. It's from truly the museum portion, the not Sanderson sisters' home. There's a cash register with some candy displays. They're selling postcards. And that's where Max gets the signature gold lighter. So I wanted to build that out, and then I got distracted by this cocktail. I found that by cutting tiny pictures out of another Condé Nast magazine and then sticking them on very thin magazine paper, if you cut them out small enough, they really do look like tiny postcards. So I was just looking for vistas or landscapes from very far away, and when put on that little rack that I made, it's a pretty convincing tiny postcard rack. If you have very keen eyes, you'll see that tiny little gold lighter there sitting on the edge, so that you too can light the black flame candle, but only if you're a tabletop miniature scale. Now the museum does have a number of stanchions. In order for the book to close, we could only fit in 2 sets. So this is the maximum capacity on stanchions that this tiny museum is getting. This is just jewelry pieces. These are just some beads, some earring backs, and a little bit of wrapped wire. It's a pretty effective stanchion in a pinch. We lucked out and found this on clearance at Joann. It's a faux leather, and the back sort of has this felt texture. It adheres really nicely with a little glue and Mod Podge. It will stick pretty well. So I first needed to get these iconic ridges that Book has along his spine, and that was just a real quick paper mache. I don't know that I've paper mache'd since I was a kiddo, but it really is as easy as getting some thick paper wet, getting a little Mod Podge out, and adhering. This is that magical faux leather we found. You can sew into it, so it sews much easier than leather would, so that Book could have actual stitching. But the nice thing is, if you just score it very nicely with an X-Acto knife and don't cut all the way through, it allowed me to make those skin binding look that Book has without actually having to break all the way through the leather. Unfortunately, one thing that this magical faux leather doesn't do is come with a pre-made eyeball. So I got out some Sculpey baked clay and just kind of started to sculpt out a little eye, knowing that I would be able to paint to match the leather later. And if you don't use this trick at home, I highly recommend it. You can get a single tile at your local home goods store for a couple cents, and they bake wonderfully, so you can sculpt right onto a glazed tile and then pop it in the oven and not have to worry about constantly transporting your items from whatever surface you were using when you were sculpting into the oven. Foil's also great, but the tile is a little bit sturdier for anything that I'm working on at smaller scale, so I can roll things out and not have to worry about trying to peel that off. It can just go into the oven right off the tile. Fortunately, there's a good bit of reference online for what book's cover looks like. We know that there's these pretzel snakes in the corner. We know there's the eye at the center of one edge, and then there's another snaky boy along the spine. And then the eye is covered in this monocle, if you will. All elements that sculpt really nicely in clay. And if you look at the original prop book, it looks more clay than cast metal, so it's very forgiving when you go to recreate it. This is a very bold move called I can match this exact color of leather by eye. It turned out okay. We hide it pretty well. So bringing in some Nuln oil just to bring out that detail in the snakes. And then it's time to start getting leather on book. So I chose to do the leather work in 3 parts. There's the spine part, there's the front cover and the back cover. And that gave me the flexibility that I need in order for the book to be able to open and close without stretching that leather too much or straining it. A lot of Mod Podge, a lot of Gorilla Glue. And then thank goodness for tiny binder clips, which just held everything in place as it was drying. It's also great when you're working with mixed materials, Gorilla Glue. It sticks to all the things. When we first started thinking about this project, I wasn't sure how I would bring book to life in a way that had a satisfying texture of book. And I think the fact that it's got the texture of leather and it's really stitched, it's got a wonderful feel to it. The clay pieces are fine, but it's the stitched leather that really sells book for me. He's fun to hold in your hands. He's got a good weight to him. So I resined book's little eyeball just because I wanted a little glossiness to it. And then you gotta give him a little tap to wake him up. Alright, it's my favorite time. It's time to prop the tiny interior and then play a terrible game called Will This Still Close? But what you're not seeing, similar to the Polly Post-a-Pocket video, is me placing items and then checking to see if it will or won't close, and then moving them, millimeters to the left or right to ensure that everything can kind of sandwich up inside book and still close. So far, so good. The nice thing about the cages is since they're hanging, they can kind of tuck up inside. But sweet, sweet little miniature book here was truly the devil. It took so many times to make sure that he was in a position where he didn't catch anything in that back wall there. Once we were good and we had the major players in place, we could move to the final steps, which was just covering up this edge here to give it the appearance of book pages, much like the original cardboard book had come with, but at this point I had destroyed it in the crafting process.
And of course, no Tiny Sanderson Museum would be complete without a miniature Thackeray Binks.
So that's it. We made our own book.
So what are some things we learned along the way? Definitely for me, time management on this one. I went into it thinking that it would take about the same amount of time as the Polly Post-a-Pocket. That was just painting something on the inside. This is building it and then also completely decorating the outside. It took longer than expected. Big shout out to all of the tiny 3D models that we were able to use to furnish the interior. We'll put links to those 3D files down in the description because that's something people do on YouTube in case you'd like to learn more about where we sourced our files.
I also think we learned a lot about just how much manipulation is required to put fake leather on the outside of a book.
Cool boy!
Oof. There's a whole lot of gluing and binder clipping that you're probably not seeing happening.
Yeah, the off-camera Dani removing Gorilla Glue from her fingers was omitted for a reason. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you're as excited for Hocus Pocus 2 as we are. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and subscribe because YouTube algorithm loves it.
It eats it.
It does.
It devours your likes and subscribes.
That's how Seriously Nerdy gets out to more YouTubers. So your likes and your subscribes really make a world of difference to us. So thank you so much. Stick around. We'll be posting a Halloween glow up in October.
And now, the big reveal. Poof!